This game was played in the 6th round of a closed tournament in the Manhattan Chess Club, October of 1998. My opponent was Stripunsky, a strong Russian grandmaster who was living in New York now. For the year or so before this game, Stripunsky had built up a reputation of being a dominant action player. He was winning every 30-minute tournament in the city, and had scores of 5-0 and 6-0 against masters and international masters all over the place. And that was all I knew about him going into this tournament, because I had spent the past year or so living in Los Angeles. I had never played or seen him before. But the psychology of action chess is different from that of slow chess, and watching him in the early rounds, I sensed he wasn't very confident about his opening repertoire. I was white, played e4, c5, knight f3, e6. This was already an important moment in the game, because Stripunsky's main weapon is the Kalashnikov Sicilian, which begins knight c6, d4, cd4, knight d4, e5, knight b5, d6. And this is a very double-edged dynamic opening, which is not quite sound. It's very, very hard to play with white if you don't know it, but if white has a lot of time to prepare, you can almost refute the opening. White can be guaranteed a big advantage with good preparation. So in all of Stripunsky's action tournaments, he had played this because the opponents couldn't prepare for the games, and because in a quick tournament, initiative is very important. And surprise has a huge value because there's not so much time to correct for surprise. In this closed tournament, he was already running away from his opening repertoire. So when he played e6 in the second move, I had seen him play. He had played a few games with that in this tournament and a tournament beforehand, which I had seen in the computer. But you could tell that he wasn't entirely comfortable with his opening. It's very good when you get your opponent running away from his main weapons. So after e6, I played d4, cd4, knight d4, a6. This is called the Paulson Sicilian. It's a very dynamic, flexible opening, very good opening, and in fact I recently spent about a week preparing it for the black pieces myself. I played knight c3, queen c7, and here white has different plans. He can set up the pieces with either the bishop on e2 or the bishop on d3. Often the Paulson will transpose into a Shinvinigan structure. The Shinvinigan is the most classical of the Sicilian structures, and that's with the black pawns on e6 and d6. All the Kasparov and non-world championship games and many games over the years have been played with this pawn structure. White will usually continue with the bishop on e2. Pawns on f4 will be castled. A typical structure, which will come up later on, will be like this. And the game is played with white sometimes building up a kingside attack with g4, g5, sometimes building up a queenside with a5, and black is looking for central breaks with either e5 or d5. It's a very tense game in which white has a little more space and black has great room for counterplay later on. This has been a huge discussion over the years, but Stripunsky doesn't play classical Sicilians. He's been playing the Kalashnikov for so long that I felt he wouldn't be entirely comfortable transposing into these types of structures. So I played with bishop e2 to allow this transposition. He played knight f6, castles, knight c6. Again, black can choose to play with d7, d6 and transpose into Shinvinigan structures, but he's not entirely comfortable with that. So after knight c6, we can see that black's idea is to keep the dark squares open. His bishop is very dynamic. It can come out to either d6, c5, or b4 at any time, or it can go to the more traditional e7 square. And if white can ever get in moves like, for instance, safely, if I could play bishop e3, for instance, f4 and e5, it would be very good for me because I have a bind on his dark squares. So that's white's plan. Notice, of course, that I can't play f4 right away. It would be a huge blunder because black can play the trick. Knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and bishop c5. I've lost my queen. We don't want that to happen. There are a lot of tricks like this in the Sicilian. You got to look out for them. So black is holding off on playing d6 because he wants to maintain a flexible game and he wants to keep his dark square bishop options open. And he might later on play with b7, b5 within this structure to play b4, undermine my e-pawn, or to play bishop b7. It's a very interesting system for black. I like it, actually. After knight c6, I played a flexible move, king h1. So the idea of this is, for one thing, to play f4, which we've seen now my king is off the diagonal, so knight d4, queen d4 wouldn't be dangerous for me. And this is a very natural move in the Sicilian when white has played f4, but it looks a little strange without the f-pawn having moved yet. But the other idea is that I want to wait and see what black's going to do. He has lots of plans. He can either put the bishop on e7, on c5, or on b4. The main plan for black in this position is to play knight takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop c5, queen d3. And this position has been played many times. In fact, black's next two moves tend to be b5 and then h5. It might seem strange. He's going to keep his king in the center, for instance, if b5, and then after white plays either bishop g5 or f4 is another plan. Black will play with h5, and then try to put the knight on g4. It's a very dynamic position, which I tend to think is good for white. He had played one game before in this position after knight d4, queen d4, bishop c5, and I was well prepared in it, and he avoided it. So my opponent played bishop c5. The one other option that he has is to play the bishop on b4. You can see that my pawn on e4 is a little vulnerable, and I've described white has two plans. One is to play with f4, and one is to play with bishop g5, but it might look as if I'm a little too slow. After bishop b4, if I play f4, for instance, I don't have time to threaten e5 because you can play bishop takes c3, bc3, and knight takes e4. The reason that this is playable for white is because of a tactical idea. I can play the bishop g5 plan, and after bishop takes c3, I have the in-between move bishop takes f6. I'm defending my knight with the bishop, and if he takes back on f6, which is the main idea, I play b takes c3, and although my queenside structure is a little strange, he has big problems with his king on e8. It's stuck in the middle, it can't go kingside. Castling queenside, as a rule, is not good for black in the Sicilian. There are exceptions, of course, but here I would also have the open b file. So his king is stuck in the middle, and this pawn, being weak, is definitely compensated by my central play with f4 and either e5 or f5. And also, I should mention that after bishop takes c3, bishop takes f6, moves like bishop takes b2 don't work at all. I have bishop takes g7 moves, and also I have discoveries with my knight. Tactically, this position is very good for white. So my opponent played bishop c5, and here we have an interesting moment. It's both a chess moment and a psychological moment. Probably the best idea for white here would be to play quickly knight takes c6, b takes c6, and bishop g5. Again, taking the space left behind, and if he were to play in the center with d5, to simply play bishop d3. So now what I've done is there's this big central tension, and his king is stuck in the middle. My king is safe, his king is stuck in the middle, so with things exploding, it's good for me. This would be a nice position, but it's rather unbalanced. While white is slightly better, it's not a traditional position. I was using a psychological idea in this game, which is that in the opening, I felt that my opponent wasn't entirely comfortable with the traditional Sicilians, because as I've described, he played this weird Sicilian with the Kalashnikov. So I played knight b3. I didn't force the game into a strange path, because I wanted him to do it when it would be bad for him. So here he has three options. What would you like to play for black here? So there are three logical ideas. One is to put the bishop on b4 to go after my e4 pawn. One is to put the bishop back to a7 to try to play actively on the a7 g1 diagonal. And one is to go back to e7. When I played knight b3, I knew what his best move was. It's put the bishop back to e7. And after I would play f4, d6, we would transpose to the Shevinigan structure, which I described before. But I knew my opponent didn't like to play this kind of position. It's a very deeply studied, difficult position. Again, I would play with a4 to stop his b5 idea. Then I would put the bishop maybe on e3. Maybe I would hold back this move and put the bishop, my other bishop, on d3, and then build up a kingside attack. My opponent wasn't comfortable in this kind of position. Although it isn't clear, and maybe the position's about level, it's just a typical opening struggle. I knew he wouldn't do this, and I was correct. He played bishop b4. The downside to his other option of bishop a7 is that it lacks flexibility. For one thing, his piece is locked into a diagonal which I can make unuseful, especially since my king is on h1. And also, he's left the f6 square behind permanently, so I can quickly play bishop g5 with bishop takes f6 as a rather large idea in the position. And the other point is that I have the option of either before bishop g5 or after playing f4. Because of the fact that I want to play e5, he's pretty much forced to play d6. And now, in the normal Sicilians, his bishop would be on e7. And now, with the bishop on e7, the d6 square would be defended, and that pawn, in the Sicilian, a typical idea for white is to build up on the d file against that pawn. With the bishop on a7, it's a much bigger weakness, because it's not defended by the bishop. So that, again, would be the downside of the bishop a7 move, leaving d6. So there are three logical ideas. One is to put the bishop on b4 to go after my e4 pawn. One is to put the bishop back to a7, to try to play actively on the a7 g1 diagonal, and one is to go back to e7. When I played knight b3, I knew what his best move was. It's put the bishop back to e7, and after I would play f4, d6, we would transpose to the Shevinigan structure which I described before. But I knew my opponent didn't like to play this kind of position. It's a very deeply studied, difficult position. Again, I would play with a4 to stop his b5 idea. Then I would put the bishop maybe on e3. Maybe I would hold back this move and put the bishop, my other bishop, on d3, and then build up a kingside attack. My opponent wasn't comfortable in this kind of position. Although it isn't clear, and maybe the position's about level. It's just a typical opening struggle. I knew he wouldn't do this, and I was correct. He played bishop b4. The downside to his other option of bishop a7 is that it lacks flexibility. For one thing, his piece is locked into a diagonal which I can make unuseful, especially since my king is on h1. And also, he's left the f6 square behind permanently, so I can quickly play bishop g5 with bishop takes f6 as a rather large idea in the position. And the other point is that I have the option of either before bishop g5 or after playing f4. Because of the fact that I want to play e5, he's pretty much forced to play d6. And now, in the normal Sicilians, his bishop would be on e7. And now, with the bishop on e7, the d6 square would be defended, and that pawn, in the Sicilian, a typical idea for white is to build up on the d-file against that pawn. With the bishop on a7, it's a much bigger weakness, because it's not defended by the bishop. So that, again, would be the downside of the bishop a7 move, leaving the d6 square behind. So bishop e7 would be the best move and the most classical move. Bishop a7 would be incorrect because it leaves the d6 square and the f6 square too far behind. He played bishop b4, which is a logical move. If you recall the tactic against bishop b4, which I had before, I would have played bishop g5, and after bishop takes c3, I had the in-between move bishop takes f6, with my knight on d4. Now with the knight on b3, this would be bad. If bishop takes f6, his bishop defends the square. He can go back and I've lost a piece. Compared, of course, to this position, with my knight on d4, the bishops aren't connecting. So that tactic wouldn't work for me anymore. So this was my opponent's idea. Bishop c5, knight b3, bishop b4. It looks like a very aggressive thing, but you have to understand. My opponent's aggression was coming out of a desire to avoid classical play. And aggression that stems out of the inclination to avoid is very risky. He didn't play this necessarily because he thought it was good. He spent 10 minutes on the move in a position that he knew well. He's played the position after king h1 many times. Then he spent some time, created an idea to avoid the main lines of theory, knight b3, bishop b4. So we can feel that black is trying to mix things up because he's not confident in his opening preparation. What would you play for white here? Take a moment and think. We see that black's threat is bishop takes c3, bc3, knight e4, simply to win a pawn. There are two different ways to approach the position. One is to try to do anything I can not to allow him to mess up my pawn structure. And the other is to allow him to mess up my pawn structure to see what he will be leaving behind. I played a simple move, bishop d3. I understood that for my opponent to play bishop takes c3, b takes c3, while it looks in some ways as if white has huge weakness, this c3 pawn. My pawns aren't connected. I have double pawns, double isolated pawns, in fact. What has black given up? The dark square bishop is a huge problem. Now look at the dark squares in this position. The a3, f8 diagonal will be hugely important. For instance, if my bishop comes to a3, it slices right through his position. The d6 square will be very weak. If I force him to play d6 later on, I can use it. So, with playing bishop d3, I allowed the ruin of my pawn structure to take advantage of his dark squares later. And this is when the conflict became very intense. He played bishop c3, bc3, d5. Now d5 is a very good thematic move. It's always good in the Sicilian to take the center if you can. But it has some problems also. For one thing, we know that bishops are better in an open game. So he just gave up the two bishops and then opened up the position. So that's one thing that works well for me. On the other hand, if he were to castle kingside, what would we play for white? Here there are two plans that would have been very good. One is to play bishop g5, to go after that f6 square which isn't defended. Of course, his knight has no good active squares. And the other would be to play simply f4, and after d6, that d6 pawn, because I was threatening e5, notice, and then an attack with the bishop on d3. After he would play d6, Eventually, that d6 pawn will be tremendously weak. My bishop on a3 will attack it, my queen on d2 and rook on d1 will eventually attack it. He'll have big problems. So both those plans would be good for white, and his king committed to the king side will be a big target later on. After bishop c3, bc3, he took the center with d5. So I played e takes d5, knight takes d5. And this is when the game really begins. What would you play with white? So now we start to use the theme of the dark squares. My opponent is threatening a pawn. The c3 guy is attacked, yes, and we have to defend it, we would think. If I were to play, for instance, c4, do you like this move? Okay, there's a good side to that move, which is that I'm defending my pawn and I'm kicking his knight out of the middle. He has different options. He could play moves like knight b4, he could play knight c3, which would be a very bad move. Although it looks active, the knight will be trapped on c3 and I can just attack it. But also, he can simply go back, for instance, to e7, and then castle kingside. His king will be safe, and my c4 pawn is very weak. Doubled and isolated, I'll have problems later on. Think back to my game against Blatny. What was the main theme of my attack? In the beginning, I wanted to keep his king in the center. The correct move, and what I played, was bishop a3, sacrificing the c3 pawn for an attack. Again, attack doesn't always mean we run forward, sometimes it means we don't let the opponent run away. With my bishop on a3, the f8 square is covered. He can't castle through check, as we know it's a rule. He has a big problem now. If he had chosen to take on c3, which he didn't, then I would probably have played queen g4, attacking the g7 pawn, just to create a weakness. He can't castle and defend it. If he plays rook g8, the h7 pawn will hang. If he plays g6, the a1 h8 diagonal will kill him, and after bishop b2, he's going to have huge problems. So the only way really to defend the pawn would be to play f5, creating even more weaknesses. It's always good to pull the pawns of your opponent in front of his king forward. I enticed the f-pawn forward, I would go back to h3, and here white has a just huge position. The dark squares around black's game are falling apart. I might play rook e1, and I'm threatening the f5 pawn immediately. The e6 pawn is weak. My knight coming to c5 will be important. If he tries to castle queenside with, for instance, bishop d7, I have two plans. One, I could continue with this theme of stopping him from castling by attacking the d8 square. I don't think I would have played that. I could choose to try to win back material right away with a very strong idea of bishop takes f5. If he plays e takes f5, queen takes c3, after he castles queenside, I'll get a big attack. Also, after bishop d7, I could leave things as they are and play a quiet move like knight c5. This would have the idea of simply entering into his queenside. If he castles queenside, the e6 pawn will be weak. I could play rook e1, attack him. He'll have big problems. And after he castles queenside, all white sacrifices open up. Moves like knight takes a6 could be dangerous later on. b6, bishop takes a6. Winning the knight back, I've won a bunch of pawns. Black's pretty much lost here. You can probably see that after knight c5, my opponent's position will be very unpleasant. So taking the pawn for him would be very dangerous. What would you play for black after bishop a3? Remember, my opponent is a very strong player, and he's going to come up with ideas to stop mine. One idea you might have is to try to castle kingside at any expense. For example, if you were to bring your knight back to e7, knight d to e7, blocking the diagonal of the dark square bishop to try to castle kingside. Can white continue to stop it? Absolutely. For instance, I can play queen h5. He still can't castle kingside now because the h7 square is covered. It would be mate in 1. The other point is that if we make black work harder and harder and harder to castle kingside, we can just simply let him castle kingside eventually and we'll have a huge attack there. My bishop on d3 will be a big attacking piece. So after knight e7, I would play queen h5, continue to stop the castling kingside. I have two bishops on an open board for a tiny weakness on c3. No problem, I have a big advantage. So my opponent decided to be flexible. He didn't take on c3. He didn't go back to e7 to try to castle kingside. He decided to try to go queenside. He played b6. So this does a number of things. For one thing, it guards the c5 square. My knight coming to c5 was going to be very unpleasant for black. And the other thing it does was prepare bishop b7 and castle queenside. Then black could have a very good game. Imagine, if black played bishop b7, castles queenside, then he has a solid position. The c3 pawn is going to be a big weakness. He has the d file. Suddenly my bishop on a3 is shooting off to the f8 square, which does absolutely nothing. Things could be very good. So as we see, chess is not a simple game. I stop his one idea so he creates another idea. I have to consistently deal with my opponent's new ideas. After b6, what would you play with white? My c3 pawn is still hanging. We don't want to lose a pawn for no reason. And also, he wants to go queenside. So how can we combine the defending of my c3 pawn, which there's no reason not to do, with stopping him from going queenside? Take your time and try to find the answer. So, I began with c4, kicking his knight out of the center, defending my pawn, and seeing where he's going to go. He played knight f6. Now let's visualize 2 moves later. If my opponent plays bishop b7 and castle queenside, he'll have a safer king, and his bishop will be on a very, very good diagonal. So let's try to deal with both those ideas. Let's try not to allow him to have a safe king, and to stop his bishop from having dominance on the a8, h1 diagonal. What did I do? This is a tough maneuver, so try to find it. Take your time. So we know that you can't castle through check. My queen is on the d file. I played bishop e2. Now we see the idea. I have the f8 square covered by my bishop, and after bishop b7, I play bishop f3, blocking his bishop from the diagonal, and my queen now stops him from going queenside. I cover the d8 square and the f8 square. Very strong prophylactic attack. His king is stranded in the middle of the board. If he tries to do something like queen d7, trading queens at any expense, then what he's doing is he's weakening his queenside too much. I might even allow him to castle, and I might move my queen, and then quickly play rook b1 and pile up in the b6 square. That's undefended now. That takes too much time to do what he wants to do. My opponent can't move slowly or else I'll get a big attack. Notice, of course, that moves like bishop d6 are coming. He made the decision to play rook d8, which of course is a victory for me in many ways because his king is now stuck in the middle. It can't go to the queen side. So the king's side or the center are the only 2 options. It was the correct decision for him. He decided to play actively. Now, we have 2 options for white. One is to play queen e2. One is to play queen e1. What would you do? Let's think about his plans. He wants to castle kingside. That would be the best thing. Is there a difference between queen e2 and queen e1 in terms of his plan of castling kingside? Remember, my bishop before was on d3, which would have been a very good attacking piece with his king castling kingside. Because I cover the h7 square, I can build up along with queen going to h3, try to undermine the f6 knight with my bishop on b2. That would be very nice. With my bishop on f3, his king will be perfectly safe on the king side. We don't want it to go there. The point is that his plan, after my queen moves, is to play knight e7, block the a3, f8 diagonal, and then castle kingside. Notice, of course, that there would have been a difference. Going back, if he had played knight e7 before rook d8, what would you play with white here? My idea was bishop takes b7, queen takes b7, queen d6. So now if he castles kingside, his knight on e7 will hang. And if he plays rook d8, my idea was queen b4, piling up on the a3, f8 diagonal. His king still can't castle because I'll win the e7 knight. He can't kick me out with a5 because knight takes a5, the pawn on b6 is pinned to the queen on b7. Once again, he has big problems. The knight on e7 is under attack, so he can't castle kingside. Try to use this idea in deciding whether to play queen e1 or queen e2. If I had played queen e2 after knight e7, there'd be nothing I can do. His next move would be to castle kingside. He'll have a safe position. My pawns will be weak. Things won't have gone the way I wanted them to go. I played queen e1. Point being, after knight e7, I simply trade bishops and play queen b4. I'm threatening moves like knight c5 and knight a5, and to attack. His knight on e7 is attacked. If it moves, the f8 square will be attacked. He can't castle. His king is still stuck in the middle. Then what I'll do is, my next move will be quite simple. I'll play rook d1, trade the only active rook that he has. Then I'll build up a central attack. This is a dominant position for white. So, I continue with my prophylaxis, queen e1. So now, black's attempts to castle are failing. But on the other hand, I've spent some time stopping him from doing what he wants to do, and chess is a dynamic game. When your opponent is stopping you or he's attacking you, you can either try to defend, which in this case would be to try to castle his king away at all costs, or to counterattack. And my opponent here decided to make the game dynamic. He played h5. which is a very strong move, and it's typical, in fact, of the e6 Sicilians, of the Paulson Sicilians like this. Now we see that his bishop on b7, his queen on c7, kind of are knifing through these diagonals. He wants to put at one point a knight on g4, maybe right away. Go straight after my h2 plan. It's kind of a barbaric, strong plan. Very simple, but very powerful. If I play g3, my h1 diagonal will be weakened, and my king is not going to be happy on the h1 square, and h3, of course, won't do anything. Notice also that tactically, like for instance, after h5, if I were to play h3, he could still play knight g4, because he's threatening queen h2 mate, and after h takes g4 check, discover check with the rook on h8, next move is queen h2 mate. So this is quite a strong idea, h5. On the other hand, if I can stop his ideas, his king will be stuck on e8, because now I no longer have to guard the f8 square, because his king castling kingside will be bad with the h5 pawn advance, too weak. So he has a strong attacking idea, but he also has made his king a little more vulnerable later on. How do we stop knight g4? A really important theme to remember in chess is that when you attack in the center, a counterattack on a flank is often a good response, and when somebody attacks you on a side of the board or on a flank, counterattack in the center is very strong. We also know the theme that if we're ahead in material or we have more pieces in a certain part of the board or an opponent's piece is trapped, it's good sometimes to trade, to simplify, because if we liquidate the pieces that are there, we gain an advantage. And in this situation, his rook on h8 is out of the game because his king is stuck on e8. He can't castle. So I played rook d1, which has a specific tactical idea against knight g4, which I'll describe to you. And also, I simply have the idea of trading off rooks. If you imagine these rooks coming off the board, then I could put a queen on d2, a rook on d1, and try to build up in the center. His rook is out of the game on h8, and I can just try to get a lot of activity. It's like I'm playing up a rook. So that's the abstract description. And the other point is after rook d1, he played knight g4. And I had an idea against the h2 square. I had a point to defend it. Take a minute and try to find what I played. I'm sure most of you know that when we're playing a game with bishops of opposite color, the rules tend to change a little bit. Pawns aren't so important, and the most important thing in the game is king safety. So a lot of the time when there are bishops of opposite color, you'll want to trade off, sometimes you even sacrifice pawns just to get your initiative rolling. The most important thing is to go after the king, because the bishops can't stop one another. They're just completely dominant along the color that they're on. So my dark square bishop is my powerful piece, and here I went into a bishop opposite color position. I played bishop takes c6. This is a strange move in some ways because we've discussed the idea of having tension in previous games. My bishop has tension on both his knights, and he doesn't have any tension on my bishop, but here it's a very specific idea. After bishop takes c6, he played queen takes c6, left the h2 square, but attacked my g2 square. He's threatening mate. I played rook takes d8, check, king takes d8, and I played f3. And here we see my point. If he plays queen c7, attacking the h2 square, I can take his knight, f takes g4, and after h takes g4, threatening mate on h2, we know I can't play g3 because of the diagonal. I can't play h3 because rook takes h3, the pawn on g2 is pinned. But here, do you see how I defend mate? I have the very strong queen d2 check, and after his king moves, I anchor my bishop on d6, cutting off the diagonal, defending h2, and I'm well defended. So after I played f3, he can't play queen c7 because of this tactical idea. He played king c8, and the game continued. We can see that my pawn on f3 is very powerful. While I can't take on g4, because it's pinned to the g2 square, it has a huge purpose in blockading this bishop on b7. The bishop is biting on granite. My f3 g2 pawns just make it completely useless. If I can succeed in stopping the h2 threat later on, then his bishop will be useless. So now let's return and look at what his most accurate move was. We see that my pawn on f3 is a very powerful blockading piece. When I took on c6, he had a way of making this setup impossible. So now we're going to return to this position. His correct move was bishop takes c6, maintaining the attack on h2. I would play rook takes d8, and he would play queen takes d8. But now the point is that there's nothing I can do to defend h2 in time and to maintain a blockade on his bishop. If, for instance, I were to play f3, attacking his knight, he'd have the very strong move queen c7, attacking h2, threatening mate. A move like queen h4 defending the pawn would be a transient defense of the h2 square, because he can undermine it with g5. Attacking the queen, I can't take as h2 goes, I'd have to come back, and then the pawns on h5 and g5 will be big in an attack for him later on. And the point is that f takes g4 doesn't do anything. After h takes g4, there's no way to defend h2. I have no queen d2 check followed by bishop d6 because his king goes on e8 instead of d8. g3 is impossible, h3, you just take it, I'm going to get mated, we don't want that to happen. This would be bad for me. So, even though he doesn't attack h2 right away, the fact is that I can't defend the h2 square while maintaining this blockade on the bishop. My best move here would be to play f4 right away, defending the h4 square. Notice his threat was to play queen h4. So I would have played f4 here, and we would have a similar position to what we had in the game, except I was able to maintain this structure. Here my opponent's plan would have been to play h4, to quickly try to undermine the h1 a diagonal. Notice if he were to play h3, I would be in big problems, because my pawn is attacked twice, it's going to open everything up, I'm going to lose. So I would have to play h3, stopping this undermining plan of his. He would go back to h6, because black now has a new weakness to take advantage of, the g3 square. So take a moment, imagine we'd been playing this position. How should white deal with the fact that black's next two moves are going to be knight f5 to g3 check, a very powerful square winning a rook? What would you do with white now? In other games I've talked about how we don't always have to stop our opponent's ideas. We can also sometimes let them happen but just reduce their effectiveness. In this position the best plan for me would be to play queen e5. And after knight f5, just to simply move my rook away, rook e1. So I'm doing two things. For one thing, I'm getting off of the forking square. Knight g3 check would attack both things. And I'm also threatening his knight. Queen takes f5 as a threat. So he would probably defend it with rook h5, which looks very strong. Knight g3 check discovery is a threat. But here I would have the simple move, king h2. I've gotten all my pieces off of where g3 would hit, and his knight on g3 will simply be an illusion. It looks very powerful, but it's nothing, doesn't attack anything, and the g7 pawn will hang. So he has no good discoveries in this position, and white is much better. The reason white is better is because in bishop's opposite color positions, the key is king safety. His king is in the center, is loose. My king is much stronger. I'm going to bust open the queen side, the center, get a big attack. White is better, but my advantage isn't quite so clear as it was in the game, because he has potentially counterplay. The g2 square is accessible to his bishop. Well, when my pawn was on f3, he had absolutely no counterplay. So we could have had this position, and I would have had a nice, strong advantage with bishop opposite color and attacking initiative. Now let's return to the game. So my opponent played queen takes c6. We were just analyzing bishop takes c6. I played rook takes d8 check, king d8. f3 defending mate on g2. And blockading the h1 diagonal. Now, if he plays queen c7, remember the difference is that I can play f takes g4 followed by queen check and bishop d6. He doesn't have that option. He played king c8, getting his king off of the dangerous d-file, and now he does have the threat of queen c7. So, when our bishop went to a3, the idea was to stop him from castling kingside. What should I do now? We recall that my bishop on a3 was put there pretty much to stop him from castling kingside. His king was on e8, I was covering the f8 square. Now, if we look at this position, we'll see that there are two main differences in the position. One is that my king is safer than his. There's simply more space around his king, which is open. And second, my bishop is dominant. I have open dark squares all over the board, and his bishop is blockaded. So, my opponent has one threat, which is to play queen c7, and if he can, to try to force me to play f4 and open up his bishop. I, of course, don't want to allow that. So what I did is I did two things. I re-energized my bishop on a3, and I stopped his threat of queen c7. I played bishop c1. So my point is I want to play bishop f4, take that strong diagonal, which of course will be very important for his king later on. Also, an important attacking idea for me later on would be to play c5, undermining his structure. And after his b-pawn moves, maybe taking on c5, maybe pushing to b5, the a5 square will be very good for my knight. But with my bishop on a3, this would just be blockading the piece. But do you see how after bishop c1, I'm stopping queen c7? After queen c7, don't forget that his knight was hanging. I was going to play f takes g4. And now after h takes g4, the difference is that I control the f4 square. Bishop f4 stops mate, attacks his queen. I'm up a piece and I'll win the game. So bishop c1 was quite similar to all the rest of my moves in this game. I'm improving my position, attacking, developing my pieces, and at the same time keeping a very, very watchful eye over his plans. After bishop c1, he can't take on c4, my pawn is hanging, because, again, I would take on g4. His knight is going. I don't have that threat right away because the g2 square is going. He played h4. With the same idea as we analyzed with my pawn being on f4, he wants to play h3, undermine the king. These positions in which there are bishops of opposite color are tremendously dynamic. The key here is to attack, to try to get some kind of initiative, to do whatever you can to create weaknesses around the opponent's king and to begin to go after them. In these types of positions, if you get your opponent on the defensive, it's going to be very important. So he played h4, a very simple idea. Do anything he can to make my king feel uneasy. I blockaded h3. It looks like a weakening move, but you have to remember, he doesn't have a dark square bishop. Imagine for a moment if his bishop were on b8 instead of b7. Then this would be a pretty crazy thing to do, play a move like h3. Because there's dark squares, he can take advantage of my dark squares with his queen and bishop. But with his bishop on b7, I'm the one who controls the dark squares, so I can use my pawns to blockade his bishop, and I use my pieces to dominate the dark squares. This is a very instructional example of how to deal with bishop of opposite color in a dynamic attacking position. After h3, he played knight f6. Now, my c4 pawn is really hanging. Also, he'd like to at one point play knight h5, probably to go to g3. Knight h5 isn't the threat right away, because after queen takes h4, I'm defending the g3 square, removing the defender of the g3 square, and also his knight is pinned to his rook on h8. But it's an idea he has for later on. So look at this position. After knight f6, what would you play with white? Remember everything I just said about pawns not being so important when there's a bishop opposite color? The key is to create weaknesses in your opponent's king position and attack. Here I sacrificed a pawn. c5. The same theme as earlier on. Remember earlier in the game, I gave up the c3 pawn to get an attack. Here once again, I'm giving up a pawn, sacrificing it, just to create some weaknesses. The point is, after he takes on c5, which is really his only option, because I was threatening c takes b6, just to bust him open, that pawn's going to leave the board anyway. You might as well get something for it. So after b takes c5, the a5 square is key. So I played knight a5, attacking his queen and bishop. Again, tension. At any moment in the game, I can take his bishop. Very important. He played queen c7. So now, black is up a pawn, but white is much better. His bishop on b7 is passive. My knight on a5 is a thorn in his side. I have a lot of interesting plans, but the key for me now is to get my initiative going. I want to start flowing on the dark squares. How would you play with white? In these types of positions, I have two real plans. For one thing, I want to watch his play. I don't want to allow things like knight h5 to g3, which in fact is a bit of a threat now, because the g3 square is covered. Notice if he plays knight h5, queen takes h4 would be pretty bad, because knight g3 check is defended by his queen, and I lose a queen on h4. So for one thing, he does have a threat, knight h5. I want to dominate the dark squares. I played bishop b2, a very strong move. So my idea now is to dominate the dark squares. I want to play bishop e5, and after his queen moves, say to d7 or something, I want to play knight c4. And we feel now that black is pretty much lost. Knight b6 check is threatened, going after the king and queen. Also, knight d6 check is threatened. If his king goes to b8, I'll have discoveries. If king goes to d8, I've centralized his king. Queen a5 check is coming. The rook will come to d1. All my pieces are working together. So bishop b2 has a very strong threat of bishop e5. And also, I'm stopping knight h5. So again, we're seeing ideas of attack while watching our opponent's ideas. It's very important to combine those ideas, because when we're not playing against bad players, they always have ideas. And when we're better, they're always working harder than ever to come up with interesting ideas. So my point is, after bishop b2, that after knight h5, I can close things off with bishop e5. In fact, this would have been a very interesting tactical try for him. If he'd played knight h5, bishop e5, he had an interesting try, which would have been knight g3 check, king g1, king h2 would be a mistake because of knight takes f1 check, and bishop takes g3 would be a mistake because my bishop is so strong. King g1, and now he could have tried this idea, knight e2 check, a strange tactical point. If my king moves, he'll take on e5, he's blocked the defense. And the point is, after queen takes e2, my queen has left the defense of the a5 knight. He could play queen takes a5. This was one possibility that he did have. The reason that it's not so strong is because we've simply made the position a little more clear. It's still bishop is opposite color, but now I have a huge advantage because his bishop is bad, my bishop is strong, and his king is completely loose, stuck in the middle of the board. All we have to do to decide the evaluation of this position, once we understand that in bishop is opposite color positions, pawns are not so important, is to evaluate king safety and bishop activity. Clearly, white has a huge advantage. This was an interesting tactical try my opponent could have gone for. Unfortunately, it wouldn't end up so well for him. So after bishop b2, I have a very brutal threat of bishop e5. He defended it and activated his rook with rook h5. So, bishop e5 now is of course bad because he defends it twice, I only defend it once. But I maintain my idea, knight c4. Once again I want to play bishop e5, and my knight is already where it wants to be. He can't allow this, that's not an option. You see how black has to defend? Knight d7. He's got to defend the square. But now notice that black's pieces are getting more and more passive. So I sacrificed a pawn to reach this position. Now I did say that material isn't so important in these positions, which is true, bishop of opposite color. But, material is a real thing as well. I took a pawn, bishop takes g7. He gave it to me, so there was no reason not to take it. So it's always dangerous to put our piece too far into the opponent's position, a piece like a bishop. We don't want it to get trapped in. I, of course, saw that he can't trap my bishop on g7 by playing moves like f6 and then trying to trap it because the e6 square is saying I would have queen takes e6. You always have to be careful if you take a pawn deep in the opponent's position, but in this position, tactically, it just doesn't work. e5 to try to lock my bishop in would just be a weakness later on, and f6 loses the e6 square. So now the position is with even material. White is better because of the difference in bishops and the king safety. My opponent had one option in this position which was enticing. He could have played queen g3, which kind of tries to force a queen trade, which is a very logical thing to do. He played this move next, and the reason it didn't work here was for a very exact long line. Queen g3 tries to get into an endgame, which is logical, but the problem is that it's a bad endgame for black. After queen g3, what would you do with white? Your emotional inclination might be to try to keep everything on the board and maintain your attack against the black king, because we know the black king is loose. But it's very important in chess to be confident of your endgame play, and to be very happy making the transition into a good endgame. After queen g3, I can force things. Queen takes g3, h takes g3, and this pawn will be a key weakness. Now I would trade bishop for knight. Knight d6 check, king c7. I would simply take the bishop, knight takes b7, king takes b7. And now a simple move, bishop back to c3. And white has a huge advantage, because the g3 pawn can't be defended. My next move will be bishop e1, followed by bishop takes g3. If he defends with rook g5, I can attack it with f4, followed by rook f3 takes g3. He can't defend the g3 pawn, there's nothing to do. And after the g3 pawn goes, then my h pawn will be a tremendous passed pawn. Bishop and rook are much stronger than rook and knight, a very important thing to know about the endgames. Bishop and rook work very well in combination with one another, and rook and knight on an open board can't defend against them, especially when I'm up a pawn. The h3 pawn will win the game. I have a winning endgame. And this position is forced from queen g3. He played bishop d5, a strong move. So my opponent has done something very clever. I had a huge initiative, and now he's given up a little bit of material to try to get counterplay. He's trying to take control of the center, push my pieces back, and of course he does have a little play. If he could get something going with putting a queen on g3 and a rook on g5, go after my king, it would be great for him. So I have to maintain the eye over his play while I generate mine. After bishop d5, I play knight e3, which brings up two things. First of all, I'm defending my g2 square, which is, the knight is good on e3, watching over the g2 square. Also, I'm attacking his bishop, which is very important. His king is very loose, and later on it'll be good for me to trade off all the pieces I can right around his king, just when I'm ready to deliver the final blow. I'm building up my attacking position. My knight was attacked. I went back, and now I'm on his bishop. Notice, of course, the bishop takes a2 would just be a very bad move. It has nothing to do with the position. It's an irrelevant pawn. I get the a file for my attack. Moves like queen a1 may happen. I can play c4, think about moves like this just to trap his bishop in there. Bishop takes a2 would just make his position much worse. If you recall, I mentioned earlier that after my bishop is deep in his game, he might want to try to trap it in there. f6 here is still not any good, although the e6 square is defended, because I would have knight takes d5. And here, if he takes with the rook, the e6 pawn is still undefended, and if he takes with the pawn, I'm sure you see that I win his rook. Queen e8 check, followed by queen takes h5. so he still has no way of taking advantage of my bishop being on g7. So now my opponent played queen g3. The idea which I had before of knight d6 check takes b7 isn't in the position anymore. He does want to trade queens, but here I can play queen c3. I just get out of the way. My bishop is defended on g7. I want to keep an eye out for the black king. He played rook g5. And now we see the power of my knight on e3. It's a tremendous piece, defending g2 forever. He's attacking my bishop on g7. Now I want you to take a minute and look at this position. Hit pause, don't go on, until you have a sense for what you would do with white. I'm going to describe the position to you for one moment, and then I want you to really think about it. Black has what seems to be a strong attacking position. In fact, it's an illusion, because my knight on e3 defends g2, and he has nothing else he can do, because his bishop can't help in the attack. The key is that black's king is very loose. I want to figure out the best way to attack the black king. How would you go about that? Take some time. White to move, what would you play? This is the kind of position for black that I often describe to my students as, it's as if black's position is a car teetering on a cliff about to fall off. His position is just barely holding on by a thread. His defenses are very fragile. His knight is defending his pawn on c5. His king is wide open. My knight is on his bishop on d5, so in all the tactical variations I can take it, as long as I don't get mated on g2. My rook is threatening to go with the b1 square, followed by queen b2, huge attack there. My queen can come to a5 anytime. In this kind of position, the key to the attack is to exchange pieces around my opponent's king. So, from that perspective, if I get rid of his knight, if I were to, for example, trade knight for bishop, imagine my bishop coming off the board and his knight coming off the board. White would have a huge attacking position. The c5 pawn is hanging. His queen set is tremendously loose. Queen a5 has seriously strong threats. My knight pretty much takes care of all of his kingside attacking ideas. That's one idea to keep in mind. The other idea to keep in mind is that his c5 pawn is a tremendous weakness. So you might want to, for example, play a move like bishop d4, attacking the c5 square. What do you think black should play if that happens? The point is that bishop d4 simply attacks a pawn on c5, and black can move his bishop back to c6 and defend it. His rook on g5 defends the pawn. So that would be a very temporary attacking move, but it doesn't really do much. Plus, remember, I wanted my knight on e3 to be attacking his bishop. I allowed him to improve his position. Here I made a strange move. I understood my opponent was getting into time pressure. I was way ahead on the clock, and he was getting very aggressive. He was trying to build up an attack. And I made a move which was played with the understanding of the fact that his position is very delicate, and almost any move that he makes will hurt it. I played bishop h8. A very, very strange move. It looks like it does absolutely nothing. I'm maintaining everything in the position, and in fact, it wasn't my best move. It was a very good psychological move because of his time pressure, and when you're in... Time pressure is a very emotional part of the game. And this was where my opponent's action play, the fact that he's playing all these 30-minute tournaments, was very important. And I honestly don't know whether I would have played bishop h8 if he wasn't a very big action player. He wants to get aggressive, and action chess is very important to have an initiative to attack. I knew that any attempt he made to attack would backfire in his face, and because of his time pressure, he wanted to attack. I knew he wanted to attack. This is a position where black has to be very careful about his defenses. And bishop h8 maintained all of my advantages. Notice, of course, again, my bishop is deep in his game, but he can't play a move like f6 because I control the square. You can look at this position, try to find an aggressive idea for black. You'll probably come up with the idea which my opponent played. I had another very interesting move, instead of bishop h8, though. My best move was bishop f6, attacking his rook on g5. But more importantly, I'm forcing his knight to take my bishop. Because if his rook moves back to g6, for example, I have the very strong move bishop e7. Now I'm attacking the c5 pawn, and if he goes back with his queen to defend it, queen c7, he's left the h4 pawn. I can just play bishop takes h4. Now I'm up a pawn, and I'll continue the attack without any problem. So it's strange, my bishop creeps into the e7 square. It's very rare that you'll see a white bishop on the e7 square, and he can't defend the c5 pawn. He has big problems. He's going to lose a pawn, and my attack's going to keep on going. If he plays c4, I would continue to go after his weak dark squares. What should white play here? Queen a5. Headed for queen d8 check. This will be decisive soon. I'm on the a6 square, and I'm on d8. Too many threats for black to deal with. So if I had played bishop f6, he would have been forced to take on f6, which looks okay. He's just simply taking my bishop, which has been the most important part of the game. But remember, it's very good for me to trade off his remaining defenders. After knight takes f6, queen takes f6. The reason I didn't play this was because of the move queen e5. A good central move, attacking my queen and attacking my knight. Of course, I don't want to trade off queens. But what I didn't see here is I have the move knight takes d5. I missed this tactical shot. I'm getting my knight out of the attack. If he plays queen takes queen, I'll play knight takes queen. Notice, of course, I couldn't have played queen takes f7, because after queen takes e3, I'll lose a knight. The key is after knight takes d5, queen takes d5, queen takes f7. I've won a pawn. It looks like black can pin white down with queen d2. But here I play queen takes e6 check, and after his king moves, for example to c7, I would defend mate on g2 with rook g1, and it does look as though white is pinned down, but the key is that black can't continue the attack, and it's a very short-lived bind, because my next moves are going to be f4, f5. I'm going to keep on pushing the pawn up the board, and when he gets his queen off of that square with queen takes f4, white will take the initiative over. We'll play queen check, we'll bring my rook into the game, and I'll mate him very quickly. His king is on the open board, can't defend against the rook and queen. So this is an interesting position to take a moment and look at. Black temporarily has strong activity. Notice, of course, that moves like queen c2 would be a mistake because I take his rook, queen e7 check. His king is stuck in the middle of the board. My f-pawn pushing up the board will force him in some way at one point to leave the g2 square. Then my rook will get active and I'll mate him quickly. You can analyze this position to prove it to yourself. It's very instructive how the rook and queen can't be stopped against the black king. So this position would have been winning. So as we've seen, bishop f6 would have been probably my best move on the board. The reason I didn't play it was, for one thing, I didn't see knight takes f6, queen f6, queen e5, knight takes d5. Now, there's another element to this position, which is time. My opponent was in big time pressure, and I made the decision not to invest a lot of time on this move. Probably if I had decided to spend 15 minutes in this position analyzing bishop f6, I would have been able to find knight takes d5. But I played the next move very quickly, for psychological reasons. Black's position is very delicate. Every piece of his is ideally placed, except for maybe the bishop on d5, for the defense. His knight on d7 can't move. His queen on g3 is holding my knight on e3 down to the square. His rook on g5 is well placed, guarding the center. Nothing can move, and yet he has no attack. So bishop h8 is just kind of, the car is teetering on the cliff, and I'm just letting it teeter there, kind of throwing a feather, making it his move, seeing what he does. Any move, pretty much, will have a downside. Now, put yourself in my opponent's position here. You're in big time pressure. You have about 3 minutes left for 10 moves. You expected me to play a move like bishop f6 or do something aggressive. Maybe you're even looking at something like bishop f8, attacking the c5 pawn, where the knight takes f8, queen takes c5, takes f8. You're looking at tactics. You're calculating a lot of things. I'm sure you were looking at bishop d4, all these attacking moves. You've been defending the whole game long. You know you're hanging by a thread, but you're hanging. And then I make a move like bishop h8. What do you think your psychological reaction will be to that? It's important to remember that chess is not purely scientific or anything. It's competition. It's psychological. It's warfare. So what are you going to do? Definitely, his heart started to go. He got excited. He started thinking about what he could do to be aggressive. And he didn't want to just sit around now. Now was his moment. Now it's like I gave him breathing space. And so he lashed out with f5. It's very important to understand the psychology behind this moment. Just when he was thinking about how I had all these strong, direct tactical ideas, I played a move which did almost nothing. Just left everything hanging in the position. And now he felt that this was his chance, and he played f5, leaving a key hole in his position. After bishop f6, knight takes f6, queen takes f6, his rook no longer guards the e5 square. Queen e5 is impossible. And now he has to defend other ways. His position is falling apart. So in fact, after bishop f6, he can't take it. It turns out that his best defensive move was bishop c6, just trying to maintain everything. Then the game would continue, with white having a big advantage because of his loose king. He tried to play aggressively. He played f5, which is just what I wanted him to do. This move, it looks strong because it's trying to undermine my knight on e3 with f4. In fact, that's, again, more of an optical move, because when my knight comes to g4, I'll be locking him down. His real attacking idea was f4, knight g4, and he wants to play rook takes g4. My f-pawn can't take it because then he'll have queen takes g2 mate. And after rook takes g4, h takes g4, his plan is to play h3. Keep the attack going. If g takes h3, queen takes h3, my king is loose, his queen is inside, and it's actually going to be a draw now. King g1, back and forth, perpetual check. So his idea makes some sense. He wants to attack me. So he played f5 with the idea of f4. What would you do with white now? His aggressive move was mostly a desperate move. He didn't know what to do, he was in time pressure, so he lashed out, attacking. Typical action chess instincts. Here I played the strong bishop f6. I'm attacking his rook. Now if his knight takes, we see that his whole position will be disappearing. The reason I waited until f5 also was because after f5, bishop f6, if knight takes f6, queen takes f6. You remember with the pawn on f7, his key defensive idea was queen e5. With the pawn on f5, queen e5 is impossible because it's not defended by anything. And here with my queen takes f6, his position is totally lost. My queen and rook will combine, rook b1 being the next move to mate him. We can see after knight takes f6, queen takes f6, his best defensive idea is rook g8. And here I would squirm further into the position with queen e7. I'm threatening the c5 pawn. If he goes back with his queen, queen c7, do you see what I would play with white? Here I have knight takes d5, and after e takes d5, queen e6 check, I win a rook, fork. Notice, of course, that knight takes d5 defended my queen on e7. So after queen e7, I would have been attacking his pawn on c5. He plays c4. And now, white's attacking idea is very strange. There are a lot of very aggressive things I can play, like rook b1, moves to try to run forward. But in fact, the move that wins the game is the simple rook g1, which is quite typical of the rest of the attack. Black's king is loose, my queen is near it, and the attacking moves don't run forward. They simply let black's position self-destruct. The point is that his bishop is the only defensive piece left, defending everything. And pretty much in the last moves, the theme of my attack has been to trade off his defenders. Rook g1, the bishop can't move because the e6 square will hang. And my next move is very simply going to be knight takes d5, removing the final defender. I had to defend the g2 square first, and then I'm going to go after him. After rook g1, he has a lot of ideas that don't work. For example, if he plays queen e5, I would simply play knight takes d5, and after queen takes d5, rook b1, he's left the g2 square, so I can too. And now the attack is unstoppable. My next move, for instance, will be queen a7. He can't defend his king. You can try to figure out this position a little bit. Look at moves for black. There's nothing you can do. My queen and rook are devastating. If instead of queen e5, he tries queen g7, you see what I would do now? Simply knight takes d5, e takes d5, queen c5 check. And whatever he plays, the d5 pawn will go. Later on, I'll check him. Finally, I'll bring my rook into the d or b file with check. His king will fall. Notice, of course, also after my queen is on d5, I can play f3 to f4 to defend the g2 square with my queen. And then my rook will come into the game freely. So rook g1 is a very difficult move to find, but it's devastating. His final attempt after rook g1 would be to lash out with bishop takes f3. All defensive moves don't work, so this is one last attempt at aggression. But after bishop takes f3, I'd simply play queen takes d6 check, king d8, and now queen takes f5. An attacking move that defends his mate threat. Notice he wanted to play queen takes h3 checkmate. I don't want to allow that. The g2 pawn was pinned. But after queen takes f5, I'm defending the h3 square, his bishop is attacked, and his king on d8 will be descended upon by all my pieces. Rook d1 check is coming. After his bishop moves off the diagonal, everything is falling apart. So the key to my attack is consistently, slowly but surely, meet his threats and let his king fall apart. His structure is not solid enough to maintain the position. So we'll return to my move bishop f6. After bishop f6, he played rook g6. He felt that after knight takes f6, queen takes f6, he would have lost too valuable a defender. What would you play now? My idea was to keep on entering his position with my pieces. Bishop e7. Once again, the dark square bishop becomes dominant. The c5 pawn is hanging. If his queen goes back to c7, remember the idea? h4 is hanging. Big problems for him. Plus I could play queen h8 check if I wanted to, king b7, and then rook b1 check. bring things into the attack. This will be devastating as well. Black's game is falling apart. So after bishop e7, he has to defend the c5 pawn. What can he do? In fact, it can't be defended without giving up too much, so he decided to counterattack, f4. Now we remember his idea. If I play knight g4, he wants to take on g4, and after h takes g4, to play h3, try to get something going. This is the critical part of the game. Remember the theme from the very beginning has been the dark squares, taking advantage of his dark squares. White to move here, what do you do? Now is the part of the game where we get very, very exact. I played the super aggressive queen a5, giving up my knight on e3. There's no reason for it anymore. I have forced mate. I'm going for the d8 square. Do you see what black can do? He defended with rook g8. Now if he had taken my knight, f takes e3. I would win by force. Queen d8 check, king b7. Now rook b1 check is very strong. If he goes to c6, do you see what I play? First I play queen c8 check. He has to defend with queen c7. Now I've taken away the key square for him, and now I play queen a8 check. The only move to avoid mate is queen b7, and then after queen takes b7, it's checkmate. So if instead of king c6, he plays king to a7, what do you play with white? There are a lot of things to win now. Probably the simplest is just to play queen takes d7 check. Mate will follow. I'm up a piece and he's going to fall apart. It's mate in a couple moves. So he attacked my knight on e3. I played queen a5. He can't take on a3 because of forced mate. He had to defend with rook g8. Now, one more move in the spirit of the whole game. We're taking advantage of the dark squares, attacking, developing our attack while watching his ideas. How do we play with white? One enticing move is to play queen takes a6, which would be a big mistake, because although we're taking a pawn with check, he can just go back, bishop b7. White has no more checks, and his next move is going to be f takes e3. It's very easy to lose winning games. Think about it. I'm attacking, but he has a threat too. Dark square attack, stop his idea, combine everything. I played bishop d6. My bishop squirmed in from h8 to f6 to e7 to d6. I'm threatening queen c7 mate, and at the same time, I'm pinning his pawn on f4. F takes e3. The queen on g3 is going. Attack and defense, combine it to the very end. Bishop d6, the only chance he has is to run away. He played king b7. And now after the simple queen c7 check, king a8, queen takes d7. Black is completely lost because he can't take my knight because the queen is hanging. He returned with queen g5, threatening my knight on e3. Now one last simple move. It looks like he's attacking my knight and it can't move because of the g2 square, but I lock him out forever. Knight g4. I'm up a piece. His king is falling apart. He's going to get mated soon with bishop takes c5 and queen a7 mate. He resigned here. So looking back at this game, the key weakness that I took advantage of was the dark squares. And it all started when he played bishop b4, then he played bishop takes c3, b takes c3. I sacrificed a pawn to keep his king in the middle of the board. Then I combined my attacking ideas with my defensive ideas. I watched his attack, and I went after his king. And the main way that I went after his king was keeping it in the center. Finally, it was bishop opposite color position, and I was happy to sacrifice a pawn in order to create more and more weaknesses around his king. Remember, in bishop's opposite color position, the key is to attack, to get initiative. And if you have to sacrifice a pawn or even two to do it, go for it, man. Chess is a fight. If you get the attack, your opponent will have to defend. Sometimes it's very important to be aggressive in chess, and bishop opposite color positions, in the middle game, we're not talking about the end game here. Middle games with bishop opposite color is the time to go for the initiative, and that's what I did.